Hello, welcome everyone. If you can hear us well, please type in the chat on your right-hand side. I just want to make sure. Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so let's start. I'll just share my screen with you guys. Okay, so here we go. Guys, welcome. My name is Carolina and I'll be your host today. Today we are holding a webinar titled Agile for Your Company, How to Implement Successfully. This webinar is run in a form of a conversation between representatives of two companies, Boldare and Brass Willow. In a discussion, we'll explore benefits of Agile and various approaches to implementation based on real-life case studies. However, before we begin, a few words of introduction. As mentioned before, this webinar is co-hosted by Boldare in collaboration with Brass Willow. You may wonder why these two companies will be talking about Agile implementation. So first, a little bit of a background. Boldare is a digital product design and development company who helps businesses from around the world on their digital transformation journey. We've been practicing Agile for around 10 years, delivering web and mobile apps for our clients, but we've also been helping clients with Agile implementation and change management from a practical standpoint. Brass Willow is a group of licensed trainers working together on interesting Agile projects. They've been working together for the past 6 years. They also consult, but teaching is their main objective. Exchanging experiences in teaching Agile in various places around the world lets them adjust to the needs of any organization. You can find out more about Boldare by visiting boldare.com and a bit more about Brass Willow if you visit brasswillow.pl. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Please meet Artur Belka, Customer Success Guide at Boldare, who works directly with our clients. Dorota Jabłońska, Scrum Master, who's working on several Scrum teams within Boldare. And Kate Hobler, Professional Scrum Trainer from Brass Willow. If at any point you have any questions to our speakers, please do not hesitate to post them in the question tab on your right-hand side. During the webinar, Artur, Dorota, and Kate will pick the questions and answer them together. We will not host a dedicated Q&A session after the webinar, so please make sure to type in those questions as soon as they come up. If you don't feel like posting your questions in public, or if something comes up after the webinar, you can always get in touch with us at hello@boldare.com. Guys, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, welcome everybody. This is our chance to say hello, and we will be talking a lot about agility and its introduction in our two companies. So the first thing that we wanted to share with you is what actually is business agility. And we were looking for quite a few definitions of what that might be. Actually, there are hundreds of them all around the internet. So if you Google business agility, you're probably going to find maybe closer to even a few thousand, because every single company defines it differently. But there's this little thing that we thought about if it comes to business agility, and we thought that business agility comes from something we decided as inclusive leadership. So something that lets your leaders, instead of only setting direction and pointing, yeah, let's go that way, that leader is actually inviting everybody to participate in that journey with them on many different levels. So this inclusive leadership was able to help us cope with the COVID pandemic and many other things that we have encountered in our past. So based on that, ladies and gentlemen, how did Boldare cope in the COVID-19 situation?
Thank you, Kate, for this introduction. As you mentioned, there are different business agility models, we can even call them, that the company can adopt in order to cope, for example, in pandemic times. And for Boldare, I think the main advantage that we had as far as business agility is concerned was adopting holacracy. Holacracy is a way of structuring and running your company, not in a hierarchical way, but sort of distributing the autonomy and the enabling teams to actually take their own decisions. Of course, there is a purpose, there is a vision for the whole company, but the way we want this strategy or the way we want to achieve this overarching vision is actually distributed into different teams. In holacracy, they are called circles. Every circle has a specific purpose. So the purpose of existence of a circle. And I think this is very helpful, especially in uncertain times, because it basically means if a purpose for a specific circle ceases to exist for some reason, for example, the pandemic made it no longer valid, you can always change and sort of readapt and sort of reorganize into something that actually is valuable for our business. And that's actually how we dealt with the pandemic on the organizational level. People showing or creating the circles and finding the purpose that is now more valid than it was, for example, before. Decisions are happening faster because they are taken by the people who actually need those decisions to happen. It's not like there is somebody in the company that takes all of the decisions for everyone. Whenever you need something, you make it happen. And it's not only valuable as far as the speed of reaction is concerned, but it's actually more engaging to people who are working there, because if they can take ownership of what they are doing, they are actually more creative. They find ways so that their purpose is filled. They are more engaged in what they are doing. So there is no longer a need for example, a big restructuring of a whole department or a division in a company when something changes or when the pandemic strikes. All we need is like changing a little bit. The structure changes daily. For example, every circle can adapt to the realities they are now. And the structure of the company can change several times daily. So it actually is a really valuable process to have when you deal with uncertainty, changing realities, and changing markets. So I personally believe that holacracy helped Boldare, but this is not the only way a company can react in uncertain times. And I guess for Brass Willow, you adopted something else, Kate, right?
Yes, we did. Although we have that soft spot for holacracy because it makes a lot of sense in many situations, because it has this quite sturdy basics, kind of value and values basics that make it something that even if you change the surface of it, it's still going to be there. So because we were flirting with holacracy quite a few times, it actually stayed a little bit with us, even through the moment that right before the pandemic, we had some tough times right around the pandemic. We were kind of stricken with bad luck quite a few times before that. And then the pandemic hit. So what we did, we actually made a very bold move if it comes to scaling, or actually descaling, because as a consulting and training company, the beginning of the pandemic was a disaster for us, just as for every training and consulting companies basically in the country, because people were really afraid of having any events or any educational offerings online. So basically the business stopped. What we did, we actually reduced our company to only 2 people for a short period of time, so that we were able to support ourselves through the moment when we basically made no money. So we were able to minimize all the business, all the operations that we were doing throughout that time. And from those 2 people, we were able to grow back to being a total of, actually we're currently collaborating with another 20 to 30 that we keep kind of in close proximity, that we're collaborating with from time to time. And we were able to kind of shrink down and expand back in the matter of 9 months. Yeah. And also, it was also this part of that inclusive leadership, because even though we terminated agreements with many of our collaborators and we were forced to kind of push others kind of outside or to the fringe of our business, they're still collaborating with us to this point, even though we needed to make such a radical move. Yeah? So, and those elements of holacracy and that underlying agility is something that helped us greatly in those times of turmoil.
I think, guys, that these 2 things that you mentioned, these strategies to thrive and survive in COVID, were absolutely vital. So for us, Boldare, it was basically holacracy. For you, Kate, it was ability to scale up and down in a very agile and effective fashion. But there is also something that comes to mind when I am thinking about that, and that is radical transparency that we have here. When the pandemic struck, what many companies had to do is to transition very fast to 100% remote work. And it's very easy to see that it eroded culture of many companies, because communication lines were broken, rituals and meetings were not really happening, or happening in a not effective way. But we've been doing that before. Even at the time where meetings in the offices were possible, we were used to extreme openness and giving safe space, not only to guys, not privatizing information, sharing what you think in a very open fashion, and also giving a lot of safe space for that. And it's even more important when we are working 100% remotely, because people can learn faster if they have access to information, if the company has no secrets, and they make decisions faster. Also, if clients know absolutely everything, as much as humanly possible, about projects, how they are progressing, how we work, that inspires a lot of confidence in these not very easy times, I'd say.
Yes, exactly. And a thought that I have while discussing different ways in which this business agility can help, I have a thought that in every case, this change or this approach needs to be somehow adopted or even promoted by the C-levels, right? So how do you think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I support that fully. The C-levels are people who make the change. They might not be the first spark for the change, but they are the ones that actually conduct the change. I remember that years ago, I have been speaking to a colleague that was working for one of the major banks. And he said that the real change in that bank started happening when their CEO stopped wearing a tie. So that was the most crucial moment. And what we tend to forget in lots of our agile endeavors, especially as as being kind of immersed in Slavic cultures with the turmoil past, and we tend to view people who might oppose the change as somebody that is for kind of he's the villain. And in many cases, we treat our CEOs as villains, or our higher management, basically the C-level management, or kind of C-1 or something like this. It actually is the opposite. They are supposed, they have to be placed on the first kind of line of change. Otherwise, first, the change might not even happen at all. Second, they are people as well. And we tend to forget about this. Those aren't machines, the ones that make the decision on the highest level. They are people, and they're only people. So because they need to make decisions on such a high level and taking into consideration such a huge amounts of data, usually those data is filtered for them by people who want to make them as efficient as possible, which are those levels that precede the C-level directly. So what we need to do in those changes is to allow them for that inclusive leadership, to allow them to be seen and act as people and be able to work together. So just please remind, I'm reminding everybody to go and hug your C-level, because they are somebody that is going to work with you on this. Yeah? They are not enemies. They are not villains. They're just people as everybody else. And let them be those inclusive leaders. Yeah?
I think that's absolutely true. There's, hugging, as you rightly said, hugging the C-level guys is very important. And we also cannot not give attention to an elephant in the room. There is a lot of fear about that amongst people in C-level positions. Because if you go to the agile mindset, if you try to empower your teams, if you try to entrust them with responsibility and agency, you might be afraid that that might undermine your power or influence. While the reality is that is the exact opposite. If you look into what is appreciated in leadership right now, there is a transition going on. In the recent in the recent poll by Forbes, these traits that make a good CEO were evaluated, and in contrast to what was happening even 5 or 3 years ago, yeah, there is still a great appreciation and emphasis put of being a great communicator. 76% people who were asked would say that it's a great trait for a leader. Absolutely, it is. Second thing is to manage and attract talent. 80% people would say that about a great CEO, that it's a key trait. But there is a transition on the first place, and 83% of those surveyed actually say that agile mindset and flexibility is now the most important thing. So yeah, from one side, hugging the C-level, absolutely, while we are thinking about agile change, but on the other hand, it's a great benefit for guys in this position. And we are also always trying to work very closely with C-level guys to also show them how liberating this change will be for them, allowing them effectively to do what they need to do, to think on strategic level, not to be involved into escalations, into micromanagement and things of that sort.
Yes, and I can see a very nice question in the chat here. How to start transformation in a business that firmly relies on contract employees from external companies who also do not work in agile ways?
This is a beautiful question, because it just comes into the perfect moment, because there's this subject. Actually, there is this article that has been written. I think it was like 12 years ago or something like this, but it's still very, very valid. And it's called "Why Software is Eating the World." And I recommend to read that article. It's in Wall Street Journal. It's a beautiful piece of text and lots of thoughts in it. And it kind of shifts our understanding. My favorite idea from this article, or actually an example. Oh, thank you, Susanna. She found it. One of my favorite things is that we do not realize how much we as companies are actually, in fact, software companies. Because honestly, even if we're talking about a shoemaker that repairs shoes, this person depends on software on their phones, depends on the calendars, depends on communicating with their customers via digital way. Even they rely so much on software. But let's shift it to another thing. Banks. Banks are right now, in fact, software companies. What do banks do? They don't, I mean, sometimes they do, but this is a minority of their business. They don't transport cash. They make bank transfers, right? They have their own apps, which are the main thing that they're operating on. Yeah. Disney is actually a software company. Right now, Disney is Pixar. Pixar is purely a software company. So by shifting the view from our software is a liability to our software is the core of our business, which in fact is in the majority of businesses around the world right now, is we're actually changing the optics for it. And we are starting to understand that even though we are relying on external people and we are relying on subcontractors, there has to be very high level of trust in between us and our subcontractors. There has to be some kind of alignment of a business model. Otherwise, this software, instead of core of our business, actually becomes a liability. So choosing your subcontractor, choosing that someone who is going to build that software for you is so crucial because your own business depends on it. And I believe that you guys as a Boldare, you have a pretty nice approach to it. Would you like to share?
Absolutely. Thanks for that. I think it's absolutely true what you said. Software is eating up the world, and it's effectively steering the world and running it. But if I were to step back to Susanna's question a bit, how to start transformation or digital transformation, I would say go for the low-hanging fruit. Do the easiest thing first. We will go into what digital transformation is in a moment, but it is a process. It's relatively complex, and this is what we do. And so it's not an easy thing, but I might suggest that think if the team is really working, being focused on business goals, or perhaps all on something else. If you try to entrench this kind of mindset, you might be beginning to see the light, whether the team is actually focused on business goals as opposed to tasks, as opposed to increment or anything else. But it's just a small piece of advice. But if we were to discuss how we do that at Boldare, how we actually understand digital transformation and transformation of business models, there is a two-pronged understanding of what digitization is for us. First thing is digitization as opposed to digitalization. Digitization is just moving from an analog solution to a digital one. And that can be run on the product level. For instance, if you want to shift a customer service phone number and a bunch of guys who are answering questions, doing customer relationships work, to basically an AI-powered chatbot that will allow this to work, to be done on a vastly larger scale. This is digitization. This is replacing an analog solution with a digital one. On the other hand, there is something much deeper, digitalization. And this is effectively using new technologies to update your business model, to streamline it, to make it more effective, to digitize the core product that you have, or the core service that you are actually offering, to improve your customer experience across many channels, as many customers are now rightly expecting it, but also changing the revenue model in your business model, because times are changing fast and in a dynamic way, and you have to go hand in hand with that. And it's also about optimizing your internal operations on many levels. And our approach is as follows. If you think about what you need for that to be done, first, of course, you need a strategy. And strategy can be understood on the most basic level as a collection of things to be done to get somewhere. And these things that you have to do should be set in some time frame. This is the most basic definition of strategy. And any consultancy, any consulting firm who is worthy of that name would give you that. But we go much further. What we understand is that approach to change needs to be systemic. A company could be understood as a machine, as a collection of prongs and wheels turning and doing things. But actually, for us, it's a social system that is complex. And what runs it is actually culture. There is if we step back into history, as far as 1964, something happened at the MIT in the US. They made a digital computer that was positively pathetic for our standards. It could hold some 2,000 words in its memory, and it weighed 30 kilos. And what can you do with such a thing? Positively nothing if you do not have an organization who unlocks your talent in many ways, who works in small teams, who are really able to do business goals and goals to this grand project that you are working towards. And it's not that really unimpressive tool, it's the cooperation that the organization can entrench in its DNA. And what this rather unimpressive piece of technology did was actually navigating the Apollo 11 to the moon. It was such an unimpressive piece of technology, but what happened is the organization was amazing because it unlocked the human resourcefulness and the use of scarce resources to do something grand. And this is digitalization, effectively. This is using a digital technology to some extent, but also transforming the organization to use something relatively small to change the game completely. And if you challenge culture, you cannot do that effectively in a simplistic way. You will likely hit the wall. So what you need to address is actually several areas: business vision, strategy, and policies. And that is what we always tackle first. Communication channels, roles, accountabilities, common tools that we use to communicate within an organization, transparency, and the rules of communications as well. These are key aspects that you cannot go and you cannot entrench digitalization really without that. And also people, their qualification, skill sets they need. It's not only about individual units, people whose skills are such and such, but also about managing the skills within the company to actually find the skill sets that you need to unlock them. And that changes everything. So whatever is the reason that you need digital transformation for, whether this is transition in your business model, whether it is chasing your competition for whatever reason, whether this is adjustment to the market or something else, the keystone would be, strategy, absolutely, but also thinking about that as a systemic change and social change that you have to attack from various angles. And this is effectively what we do. We build digital products, but we also are a consultancy who actually advises people on how to approach digital transformation of their businesses on a much deeper level.
Yes, exactly. I would agree, Arthur. And I think you mentioned a very interesting thing that, yes, we do develop some IT products, some software, but in reality, we are also changing mindset. And I really like how it is connected with one of the questions from Michael. How do you make your clients work with you in an agile way? So I would say that it's not a forced solution. I think what is most important is to show that it's actually worthwhile, that it's actually working. because we can show it very easily. If you adopt an agile mindset to how you want to develop your product, you will actually always gain. And one of the reasons that you would always gain is that in an agile mindset, you are constantly in the inspect and adapt loop. So actually, you constantly check if what you have in mind for your users, for example, is actually what they need. So it's this constant loop that makes your product better. So it's actually also connected to the second question I can see here, how Agile can help to deliver web products that market needs. So that's actually the whole magic of an agile and of an agile mindset, that you will not produce something that is not needed. And sometimes I read statistics that are just frightening, to be honest. For example, the Standish Group in their report state that as much as 50% of features are almost never used. When you think of it, that's actually 50% of the features you developed were a complete waste of money. And of course, there are different reasons for that. But I would assume that one of the major reasons for that would be maybe you didn't check if that's actually what your users need. So being agile and releasing smaller parts of your product to constantly test how your target users are actually what is their feedback on it? Is it what they would use? Would they need a tweak to right or left with this feature? And this constant feedback loop is actually what you can build your product on. So it's actually a way of checking if your vision is a reality. And that's what the inspect and adapt loop is all about. I can remember a lot of situations working with in Scrum, actually, during which after an iteration, a sprint, we released a feature, for example, and we waited for the user's feedback. And our clients are sometimes very surprised with the direction that the actual users would like to go. We have seen many pivots that were not predicted at the beginning, and the clients themselves were really surprised. I have never expected that to happen, but actually if they hadn't tested it, they would have done a product that's actually either not used or not as highly used as it could have been. So actually, if I were to advertise, I don't like this word, but if I were to advertise why actually Agile way would be the best way to save your money and make your products better and make your products the best possible products on the market, is you have to constantly test it and check if that's what's needed. And if not, then you can pivot, then you can change, and that's completely okay, because you haven't invested the money yet on the things that, for example, on a 2-year-long iteration, you have your plan, your application will have 100 different features. You didn't invest in them yet. You checked, that's not what the market needs, and you can actually turn a little bit and deliver the best possible product for your customers. And I think that's the beauty of it. And that's what actually usually happens in a phase of in the first phases of a product development, when you have an idea and you need to check if that idea is actually something that you have. And once you have validated it, of course, you can change the approach and try a different kind of process that is still agile in its core. And for example, at Boldare, we do it in producing products in different phases. And that's, Arthur, something that you are very interested in as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. So yeah, what you told us is basically how we do that day by day. on the team level, how we inspect and adopt. But it also answers to a large degree the question that Magdalena answered, how Agile can help deliver web products that market actually needs. So it's partially Dorota's answer, but let me come back to that in a minute, because I will tell exactly how we approach that, how we try to validate business value, and how we develop products with a laser focus on business value. But there is another question from Monica, how to cooperate with companies who claim they're Agile, but in reality, they just pretend, and she finds it a common problem. I think it might be a common problem because almost every, let's say, IT or software company right now claims that they follow Agile practices and so on. What I would say probably, and Kate, maybe you could interject on that, is demand transparency and demand insight, and see for yourself. Transparency is a necessary step to agility. So there is no room to pretend here. You either there is some gray area, of course, but if you demand radical transparency and insight into what is going on, then you will know. If you are denied that, then I would probably advise to walk away. What's your opinion on that, Kate?
I would say mine is actually very, very coherent with yours. Yeah, this is actually. I would also like to interweave Dorota's what you were talking about right before that, because testing a company, whether they actually have that agility to them or have that kind of Agile core to them, is part of the process. Just like with an interview when you're trying to get a new job, it's not only that the company is testing you, you are also testing your company, because it's actually a business relationship as any other. Yeah. And when you are looking for a company that is going to supply something to you or is going to be your customer, it's the same type of relationship. It is business. So in business, you also have to test who you are dealing with. And that transparency is a great way, or actually demand a test. Yeah. Demand an experiment, so that if they are unable to deliver in the short time allotted, that means that most probably they aren't cut out to doing the work that you need, especially if you need to move really fast. So definitely, you can uncover this, and that this leadership, this inclusive leadership, and this radical transparency that we were talking about before. It's not only towards your own employees, it's also towards your business partners and customers, because they have the very right to know what you're up to and how to deal with you, how to work with you, how can they trust you? You cannot trust somebody that is not going to open before you even a little bit. Simple as that.
Yeah. That is true. Please go on, Dorota.
I just wanted to add one more thing to how to see if the company or a team is really working in an agile way or has an agile mindset. And I would say that a very important part of that is also being purpose-driven and actually knowing why you're doing what you're doing. So whenever I would see a company that, for example, says, yeah, we adopted Scrum because we have dailies. But if you ask them, okay, but why do you actually have dailies? Like, what do you gain from it? And I think this is like a way of telling if somebody actually knows the value of why they are doing this. This actually means that, okay, they have probably tested other, other ways of doing it. They were not as good as what you actually adopted. And that's a beautiful way of working in an agile way. Finding like a path for yourself, not because you have heard about it or somebody told you to do something this way, but actually testing it and proving that it is worth it, or this actually works for you. So I would say that being purpose-driven or being able to answer why you are doing something or what for is actually a good sort of indicator of how agile this mindset actually is.
I do agree. I do think so. And there is another thing that came to my mind that you should definitely do. Ask for data and ask for metrics and look for insight into that. Because when we are talking about agile development of software, any other process and so on, it is iterative, it is incremental and so on, but it's also extremely well documented. The adoption, the inspection, the change that you do from iteration to iteration is done upon data and upon grounded collection of information that you should have. If it's not collected, if it's not analyzed, something's obviously wrong here. So this is how you actually may try to see where this transparency is. It's in communication style, yes. It's in disclosing basically everything, unless regulated by law, yes. But it's also in the insight into metrics that regard the product, the backlog, development, and so on. If your partner cannot reveal that, then there is something you should definitely try to work on here.
And we're not advocating going against the GDPR. So no, that's not.
No, not a good idea. But we're not talking about that here. And there are, of course, some areas which cannot be really, where we cannot be transparent sometimes, and this is GDPR protected data, but also sometimes we are bound by contracts with our clients, and that stops us from revealing some information even to some team members. But these are extreme cases. These are edge cases, really. So to almost everything else, there is no real impediment to why we should not reveal that. An aspect that is slightly controversial, especially in our culture, is remuneration. It's actually how much people on the team would be paid. And this is always tricky. That is very culture dependent. It's viewed differently in many countries, and there are many organizations where this remains the last point where this full transparency is not kept. But it is what it is. Everything has some up downs and bright sides, and I guess you should not go for radical transparency without being grounded in where you are, in where you operate, and what consequences that could have. Introducing digitization, agile way of doing things and doing business, and entrenching visibility should also be made with common sense and a very good investigation of what the result be. And also that takes time. That can take years to really transform a company into that, and you will need a really good plan for that. And also, as with developing a digital product, you will need to inspect and adopt to what is actually happening. And maybe sometimes it's too early for some things. And that also includes introducing this transparency, metrics, measuring things, measuring performance, measuring what you do with products, basically all of that. So it should also be grounded in the gain that you would possibly draw from it. But
yes. Sorry, I just wanted to summarize, like, I really love the approach, start with what you've got. So first, see where you are, and only then try to slowly do something with it, right? So that's actually, I think, a point, a very important point in any kind of change that you would like to adopt.
And actually, sometimes just baby steps are a good idea to start. Start from what is the easiest, and from what you can. And even small change, if it is done right, can inspire people and empower them to take more responsibility, to feel more empowered, and so on. So start small and just be iterative. Inspect the result of that. And maybe you made a mistake. Missteps also happen. So it's complex, but the solution from that complexity is basically this approach, being iterative and inspecting what you do. And that leads us a bit to this topic of how exactly we approach product development and digital transformation and time to market matter at Boldare. How we try to deliver value at every step. at every step of product development. What is our general process for that? First thing is that there is this Agile manifesto that many of us know, but it's a very brief document. As a matter of fact, there are just a few sentences, and there are versions of it. The version that actually touches on software delivery adds an important component. The process should be iterative and incremental, and that includes delivery. That touches on how delivery should work, but it also should be delivery of a valuable product, of valuable issues and valuable features. So you need to do all of that with your laser focus on the business goal, whatever it is at hand. This may be the way to monetize a product. This may be investigating and verifying whether the product or the feature is being accepted by the users at all. If it's useless, if it's usable, verifying any other hypothesis, but this very hypothesis needs to be business bound, and at the optimal model has to be set out by the product owner from the side of the business, of course with cooperation with the team. But that culture of being driven by business goals and being focused by business goals at every level needs to be entrenched on the level of the organization's DNA, so that it's not really lost within the day-by-day process. This is what Dorota told us about how it's actually done every day, this inspection of adoption and checking if actually we are still progressing in the right direction. At a slightly higher level, the way we approach it is a practice known as full cycle product development. That starts with prototyping, building the very most basic version of the product you can imagine, not even destined to be ever looked at by the customers, but just verifying the basic tenets of how that could possibly work. Second one, the second stage would be the minimum viable product. The version of the thing, of the digital product that can be used by users, maybe in some limited environment, testing the very basic business assumption, whether that works on the market at all, whether people can use it at all. There are many other criteria that this may be used to verify, but this is the most frequent one. The other one, the one that follows, is actually what we call product market fit, adjusting the working product. And this is not necessarily the MVP. This could be something quite further down the way to the particular demands of the market, of how well it is being monetized, what exactly we need to do to make this more effective. And then we go to what we call scaling, adjusting the product to work at a vastly larger scale. What we are saying to our customers at the very early stages, in order to explain to them this process, is that you may very well expect that we will need to use a different technology at different stages of the product development cycle. If you are starting up as a startup, let's say, with a new product, this can run splendidly with a technology that is enough to just make it work for several thousands of customers a month, or perhaps even a week. But as you grow, and we wish that you grow very much, and we work towards that, and if you go to the scale of thousands of requests being actually fulfilled by the software every second or every minute, you are facing vastly different infrastructure requirements, safety requirements, data management requirements, and that might warrant big technology change and a lot of work. But what you have to keep in mind is that by that time, your business and your product will have very solid revenue stream. We will try to walk with you hand in hand with that in our mind. And that basically is the mindset that we need to entrench into the organization that we work on basically every day.
Yes, exactly. And especially when you mentioned that different phases actually are meant for different purposes. So as you said, for example, a prototype, you would usually build a prototype to see if your idea is even valid, Like, so you don't even need to code anything for some prototypes. Sometimes all you need is actually a piece of paper. You just draw something and you ask people, would you, for example, what do you think of it? If that's what you would like to validate, of course. So it's a very important thing to understand that each of the phases that you describe, Arthur, are actually meant for something different, for a different purpose. So we wouldn't use prototyping for a well-established product. Of course, for some part, for example, if we have a new direction you would like to go with the product, we might start with prototyping. Is that the direction you would like to take, right? But definitely the different aspects and different requirements for every phase. And what I actually really like as an example is an MVP. An MVP should be able to deliver a minimum viable product to our customers. And I believe that for some reason, a lot of companies have a great struggle understanding what an MVP should be. Very often, for example, we would think that we need, I don't know, to cover every possible and potential need of our target users to release an MVP. And that's actually a very common mistake. And I believe it might also be connected with the scope creep question that we had, how to deal with it. So it really depends what the scope creep is. But if I understand it correctly, what you meant, if you find yourself having constantly new things added to your backlog that you really have to produce before you can even go live, that's maybe the problem with understanding what you actually want to achieve. Because if your goal, your purpose is to give your customers something to work with, something that actually fills their basic need, and to see if that's actually the direction you want to go with, you shouldn't have any scope creeps, right? Because you would actually only be aiming at fulfilling the most urgent needs of your customers, releasing it, and then testing what else should we add on. So I really see it very often that this common misunderstanding of what we want to achieve with our product. Is it validating, if that's actually needed? Is it already product market fit, whereas we actually add and we adapt our product to new or changing realities of the market that your product actually lives in? Is it already scaling? So it's really different for each of the phases and should be treated differently, I believe.
I do believe so as well. So another thing that I might add to this scope creep is open communications, and also creating the space within the developer team for that, for exactly that, for telling the product owner what the exact situation is, how much time we have, and where exactly we are, and doing that in an assertive way. And we need a space for that. We need a culture that will enable team members to do that. And assertiveness is not aggression. It's just communicating things in such a way that they really will be understood. So it's actually working for the benefit of the person who might be trying to derail this process slightly by going into the direction that might result in a scope creep. But as Dorota mentioned, this shouldn't really be happening. If we are managing the process well, this is not something we should be facing. And if we prioritize well, in a grounded fashion, in really having on our mind what is the priority and what the business actually demands.
Yeah, there's actually this connects a little bit with another question that's in here. So if it comes to scaling Agile, because this is the problem of a different kind of a different optics, different viewpoint, because if you focus, just like you said, if you focus only on scope, that scope is going to creep, because you want to, if you treat this as value, it's going to get higher and higher because you want to get as much value as possible. But value is not directly connected to it. And this also talks about scaling. I don't know if you know, but Live Chat, one of the most prominent Polish companies if it comes to the IT market, when they hit one of the financial marks, and I can't remember which one. You can definitely dig up this information. I think it was $100 million in net worth, or 100 million zloty in net worth. I'm not sure which one it was that. They only had 12 people developing the product. 12. That's it. They were still in their office. That is, in fact, an adapted apartment. Yeah, and they were still fitting in there. So scaling is depends on what you want to scale, because scaling your product is way more important than scaling your organization. And you might be able to deliver almost every product within a small scale. But there also might be a situation where you want to expand a little more. And how to do that. It is a myth that Agile is not supposed to be scaled, but Agile does not focus on scaling your organization. So it wants to avoid it as much as possible, because scaling introduces complexity. And actually, it is the first rule of scaling: don't. Because scaling is like, many organizations, what they want to do is, scaling is so fashionable, let's scale, and it's going to be great because we're going to be so happy with that. But in fact, it's exactly the same case as which you have a pair that is really a pair of people, a couple that is fighting, and they want to solve all of their problem by making a child. Yeah, it's exactly the same situation, because you think that this is going to be your salvation, but in fact you're introducing complexity. And there are actually two approaches to scaling Agile. One of them is a transplant. So basically, you're taking what worked in one company and you're trying to implement it in another, and it's bound to fail. It might work, but it's just like with human transplants. If you take a random human, and if you want to transplant an organ to another human, there is a slight chance that it's going to work, but the chances are really, really small. That's why transplants don't usually work. And for example, the Spotify model, or so-called model, because they don't want to call it model, that's a long story, it's an example of a transplant. SAFE is also an example of a transplant. But there are also frameworks that are only guiding you in a specific direction, which are taking what worked in another companies, and they're telling you, hey, this is what worked in 60 plus companies that we've interviewed, or we have actually measured, and we're giving you what worked in there. But make sure to adopt it to your unique needs, because scaling with Agile is Agile itself. So you need to experiment. You need to have that radical transparency. Otherwise, it is going to fail. So yeah, of course you can scale agility. There are huge companies that are very Agile. It's just that do it in the right way. Yeah. And if you can, don't.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever you think about, okay, should I scale? Because now I have 1, 2, 3, or I have 10 people in a Scrum team, so I definitely need to scale, right? Because it's too many, and we just have to do it. Then I would always go with the first and most important question: why? Like, I think the right question is why? Why would you scale? And then if you actually think of problems that you actually are encountering right now, you should be able to find a perfect solution. And maybe in some cases, this perfect solution would be scaling. But maybe you don't need to put a whole frame on a problem that you could actually solve in a way simpler way, in a simpler way, right? So I think this gives us a perfect loop to the like how we started this meeting, and this question of being purpose driven. I would think that it's a nice food for thought to everyone is just always think about why you want to do something or what problem you want to solve, and only then decide on the measures.
All right, perfect. So I guess we need to thank you. Oh, Kara, you're here. Great.
Yes, guys, thank you so much for your attention, and special thanks to our speakers today. I just want to say a few final words, if you can guys bear with me. So basically, we would like to invite you to a 15-minute feedback with one of our colleagues, Anna. Basically, what we try to do in an agile fashion, we try to be better every time we deliver great content for you guys. So Anna will be in touch with you to ask about your feedback. Also, if you have any additional questions, you can chat with her. She'll be asking for your insight and also your challenges that you're facing at the moment, so we can prepare that better content for you guys in the future. So please look out for her in your LinkedIn or email inboxes. And on the final note, if you enjoyed today's session, we would like to stay in touch. So please subscribe to our Digital Shift newsletter so we can share with you more exciting content handpicked by our CEOs, and information about forthcoming events such as webinars as this one. You'll find the link to subscription landing page in the chat. And this is all from us today. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Thank you so much for today.